Amazing. Welcome back to Be the Change. I'm very happy to have with us today Rhodes Perry. Rhodes is joining us from the US. Rhodes is a very well-known author, advocate, consultant, guru, I'm going to suggest, in the DEIB space. And we're going to have a conversation today, or a couple of conversations actually. So thanks for joining us. I appreciate you being here and making the time.
It's a pleasure being here. Thank you for the invite. I'm really excited to connect with your audience.
Absolutely. So today we're going to have a little look at DEI and in that space, because a lot of organizations and companies are dropping the E, which I don't quite understand myself. Maybe they're confused about something, or maybe they just don't get it. So what are your thoughts around that piece?
Yeah. Well, it's an important question and a really good one to lead with. So here in the United States, the Society for Human Resource Management, they're known as SHRM, made that decision. And they're a professional organization that chief HR officers, people that are leading other people, they look to SHRM in terms of their standards and, what's best practice. So for those of us who are DEI practitioners, it was alarming to see backtracking taking place. And I would argue, that backtracking is in response to the scrutiny on our field, on the diversity, equity, and inclusion field, and trying to still convince certain businesses to continue investing in this kind of culture building work, which I would argue is a prerequisite to any successful business, is building a healthy culture. And their rationale was to say that equity was too hard to explain, it was too hard to define. And I really love, I really love the work of Lily Zhang and other people who have focused a lot on the definitions of DEI to kind of get us, anyone in the workplace to recognize this very simply as outcomes. So diversity is a people outcome. We can look around, we can see whether there's good representation in the communities where our businesses are located or not. Inclusion is a behavior outcome. So how do we relate to each other interpersonally? How do we have more skillful ways of using inclusive language? And equity is a systems outcome, right? So if we want to make sure that people are practicing inclusive behaviors, we would want to look at performance reviews as a structure or a system of how we kind of reward talent when they're in alignment with our values and they're helping our organization be healthy, right? And so it was kind of shocking to me to see that, because it really adds to a lot of misinformation about our field and what it's all about. And the equity component is really important to make things stick. If we're not looking at policies, if we're not looking at even the physical structure of our organization, then that makes practicing those interpersonal behaviors more challenging, right? And it doesn't make it impossible. So my heart is warmed because there are many organizations as well as DEI practitioners that are skillfully, providing a response to that, and also acknowledging, right, that for those of us practicing here in the United States or around the world, sometimes, people, we don't have kind of agreed upon ways of talking about DEI. I mean, I really like the outcomes perspective because it makes it easy. When we talk about outcomes, we can then measure it, and it's not that hard to do. And once we start to measure if we're being effective, we're more likely to make additional investments when we see that needle moving in a healthier direction. So those are just like some of the initial thoughts on the equity component. And, I'm kind of curious, like how that's how you see that kind of showing up in Canada, or if that's even kind of influenced the field where you're at.
Yeah, I don't see that trend of us looking at taking the E out, to be honest. And I guess even those of us working here, we kind of build on that of putting the B in there for belonging and putting the AR in there for anti-racism. So let's not build that alphabet, right, of things that belong within that. And I know it does become complicated because just like, LGBTQ or 2S LGBTQ, it's kind of like acronyms. What do they mean? And I think for organizations, they need to really start somewhere and start looking at how they're treating their people. And some of those are around metrics. What are you measuring? What is your benchmarking? Like, what are those things based on? And do people ultimately feel that they're part of solutions and part of teams, right? And looking at some of those things. What are your thoughts on that? Like, because you form a whole community around belonging and which is heavy on the B, right? Like
Oh
within
yeah.
that acronym of what that looks like for us as people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, the reason why I orient most of my work around belonging is because I feel like it is this North Star.
Mm,
It's elusive because it's not happening for many of us in the workplace right now. When we look at people's feelings around exclusion or feeling othered or feeling like they have to cover important things about who they are and all that's lost in that, it's helpful I think, because I think when we think about the function of DEI, the function of this work, these are strategies, right? Strategies to get us to a place that is better than where our organization is at today. Like DEI strategies allow us to really take a hard look in the mirror to say, okay, what are the things that are getting in the way of the kind of culture that we want to be, the kind of culture we aspire, right? And also, what are the things that are helpful? What are the things that we want to invest more in? And when we can honestly assess where we're at, and those are all the tools of DEI, we can then start to plot how to get to a culture that I would argue is a culture of belonging, right? A culture where we can feel seen for who we are, lived experiences, all of our education, our expertise, the things that allowed us to kind of get our foot into the door, the feeling connected, having those trusting relationships, getting support so you can do your best work, and feeling a sense of pride that your values are in alignment with your organization's values. That's all belonging. And unfortunately, there's an epidemic of exclusion and othering broadly in our world, and that impacts our workplace. And I think this is the work, this is the culture work of our times, is to really kind of recognize if we maintain the status quo, what's lost, right? Like we can think about who we're intentionally including, but oftentimes we don't even know who we're unintentionally excluding. And then what's the cost of those relationships, which at the end of the day, in my opinion, I think the currency in business, as well as just living a human life on this planet, is about trusting relationships. So if we're not focused on our workplace culture, if that's just a nice to have that we'll focus on when we're quote unquote successful, that's a major loss to businesses that are just kind of intentionally, in my opinion, sticking their head in the sand, because the world is shifting. It's very dynamic, and in the United States we're probably a decade away, maybe a little bit more, of becoming a majority minority country. So this is essential. This is essential work, and I really like to root it and frame it around belonging, because it's just something that each and every human has an experience with. It's not something that impacts only a certain group of people. This is a basic need that we have to be fully self-actualized. And what a gift that could be is if we could start to build more of that in the workplace, especially for those of us who have never felt that on the job ever, And so I feel very called to do this work. I have my own personal experiences with it, and it's great when people can really make those connections of when we think about outcomes. Belonging is that emotional outcome. If I'm starting to feel this more consistently, how does this impact the way that I show up, the way that I lead other people, and perhaps how does this impact those of us furthest away from this feeling? And so I get excited by the work.
Can you tell us a little bit about, I guess, your background? Like what draws you to do this work a little bit? Because maybe some of our audience may not be familiar with your work and some of your writings.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's a big question. I think the Cliff Notes version is, as a transgender man, I transitioned in the late '90s. So like in the dark ages, I guess. I don't know. But it was a long time ago. And so at that time, I was a young professional, just kind of getting started in my career. And the early organizations that I worked for, my very first job was working for the Department of Justice. I was in the antitrust division, so we were going after monopolies. And it was very good for an econ nerd. And, so I really loved the job, right? And I was into it. And yet, for me to have access to the things that I needed, it felt very, very risky. It felt, if I asked for what I needed so that I could do my best work, I could have lost my job. There were no protections for LGBTQ people broadly in the federal government at that time, let alone trans people. So, and fortunately, right, most of those experiences, not all of them, when I felt safe enough to have a conversation with a supervisor who was supportive, who was mentoring, and sharing this truth about my gender history and asking for what I needed, or at least trying to kind of point out like, hey, there's a barrier here for me to get what I need. Can we have a conversation around that? It felt frightening because I could have lost my job. And for most of that early part of my career, people were willing to kind of roll up their sleeves and try to understand. I wouldn't say it was always great or I got everything that I needed, but at least I was able to engage in those kind of conversations. And at that time, it was a lot of emotional labor because it wasn't what I was hired to do. However, I learned over time I actually liked trying to kind of build those kind of connections across differences, and I was pretty good at it. So kind of later in my career, still working for others, I was working at PFLAG National as their policy director, and we were really focused on trying to get ENDA, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act at that time. We were trying to get that passed. And so it was a lot of education for political appointees within kind of the administrations that we were talking to, as well as members of Congress, to try to get them to understand some of the very significant barriers that LGBTQ people still to this day experience in the workplace. And from there, I had a couple of other jobs moving more into the implementation side in government to try to implement LGBTQ plus policies inside of large organizations like in New York City and their child welfare system, which was massive, trying to equip somewhere of up to 30,000 professionals with knowledge, skills, and competence to work with LGBTQ populations that were also navigating racism and poverty. And there were a lot of things going on, very intersectional work. And I realized at that point, a lot of other jurisdictions were calling to say, hey, Rhodes, like, how are you doing this here in New York? We want to replicate this. I mean, in states that like Utah, like entire states that, would surprise some people that would be engaged in this work. And I realized at that point, of course, I was giving away all of this information pro bono. And then I was like, you know what? I think I can help more people if I started a business, doing this work. And I thought I was just going to focus exclusively on LGBTQ communities inside of the workplace. And it became very clear to me that piece of like, what was my root story? My root story was around belonging, and that I had never felt that sense until I worked at places like PFLAG, where people kind of earned the right to hear my story. And when I shared it, they received it with care. And I was like, okay, I want to do this work. And I kind of want to do it differently. I want to start with the end goal, which is like, let's create cultures of belonging at work. And what is it going to take to get there? So what are the strategies available to get to that kind of belonging society inside of the workplace? DEI is certainly strategies available, ESG commitments. There's a lot of things that can contribute to getting there. And so I find that to be really helpful, just to kind of share that with other people. Like, this is the big vision. This is what it's for. How do you connect to it? And it's really beautiful because we all play a role in building that kind of culture. And so no one's losing anything in the work. You know what I mean? And we've got a long way to go, but I think we've got way more allies and people willing to be a part of that tipping point to get there. And I think, in fact, we're beyond the tipping point. It's just now we have to bring along some resistors that still don't see themselves in the work. Yeah.
How do you think that we can, I guess, help build that momentum in workplaces and continue on creating the conversation? Because, I get this every now and then, is every time you do a talk, it's always one voice in the room that kind of chirps. And is that naysayer, is that voice that doesn't quite understand, or maybe they're just playing that role that they feel that they have to. And I was like, well, how come there's no straight days, or how come there's, as the white male, I'm losing my voice now because everything's going towards diversity and I don't see myself in that workspace. Any kind of thoughts on how our allies, I guess, can kind of help in that space?
Yeah. I think I'm a huge fan of communities of practice. So there's a number of them out there. I run a community called the Belonging Membership Community, and we meet a couple of times every month. Sometimes we bring in guest speakers, other folks in the field, thought leaders, author experts, folks that are out there doing the talks and also doing the work, right? And in those spaces, we often talk a lot about both like research around tipping point, right? Where it really only takes about 25% of any group, no matter what the size is, to kind of embrace a new idea, to embrace some kind of change. And once you get to that 25%, once like you're at like 26%, everyone else kind of looks around and sees where the train is going. The train is leaving the station and they kind of want to jump on board. People don't want to be left behind. So I think that's helpful, just to build up confidence, when you do encounter folks, and this is where kind of the change management theory comes into play. There's this 20-60-20 rule where any kind of change introduced in an organization, about 20% of the people will be those early adopters. Oh my gosh, this is great. Where was this like 5 years ago? We needed that, So those are like the champions, I call those folks. 60% are kind of like the movable middle. It's like, well, I see this change, but I don't see it benefiting me at all. So whatever, I'm going to ignore it. And then there's the 20% of people resistant, no matter what it is. It can be something that's beneficial to that group of people. It's just the instinct is to be like, no, and just kind of turn away. So I think like sometimes in communities of practice, just to remind folks, like, because DEI work in particular is so connected to so many of us, it's so deep in our souls, that when we encounter someone that's resistant to it, it's almost like, oh my God, it's almost as if it's a personal attack. And so I just try to kind of diffuse that a little bit of like, look, they're going to be resistant no matter what, right? So just kind of put that into context. And then to your point, when we look at the 20-60-20 kind of way of thinking, it's kind of a crude way of generalizing people. However, it helps in preparing for conversations. Like if I'm going to encounter a champion like yourself, we're off to the races. We're like deep into the conversations. We're talking about where equity fits, right? So it's fun, right? And most of us want to be with other champions, right? So we get that. The 60%, it's a different conversation. People don't see how they connect to the work, like you said. So if someone's in that movable middle, it's a way of relating to that group of people and really getting to know the other person that you're speaking to, like what's most important to this person, and then finding that avenue to connect it to the work. And because especially if we're thinking about it in the way of belonging, there's an easy way of like, well, talk to me about your experiences of this concept of belonging. Have you felt it in the workplace? Oh, great. When were those times? And what were you able to do when you felt it? What were you able to do when you didn't, or what were you not able to accomplish, right? And so then you're putting it into the frame of those folks. And then on that last group, to your point, the resistors, is like, what I see sometimes is when people are newer to the work, they want to go immediately to the resistors. How do I debunk everything that they're saying? And they spend so much of their energy on the resistors that they miss the opportunity of just getting 5% more people from that movable middle, that 60%, to just join, and to start to do the work. And over time, you're trying to build trust with people that are just, again, going to be resistant to any kind of change, or to really honor, like, where are they coming from? Like, do they have legitimate concerns, or are these fears and anxieties that are just rooted in that idea of, I'm going to lose something. I am not a part of this. I don't see myself in this. And I think for those of us that are DEI practitioners, the challenge is not to spend a ton of time with these folks, and to be considerate, like, how do we build the bridge so that people can see themselves in this work? Like, what's that conversation look like? And am I prepared to engage in it? Or am I not the right person to engage with a group like that? And maybe I can assign someone else who's ready for that task, right? Some of us really love doing that kind of work. And I know many people that, they're not signing up to try to convert anyone to something that they're not going to be wholeheartedly supportive of. So I guess like the Cliff Note version on that, because that was a really long response, is like, try not to spend so much time worrying about resistors, right? Really kind of find your champions and then try to have some conversations with folks to relate to how the work is going to impact them from that movable middle group.
Right. I love that. I haven't heard that before, by the way, the 20-60-20. I really like that. That's a great way of reconciling how people are within workspaces. So if we can do that, if there's that 5 or 6% that we can move over, then we become early adopters. That's great. I love that. That's a good takeaway for sure for us to look at workplaces and spaces. I've heard this said before, and I kind of chuckle, is that DEI work is not like a piece of pie, so that there's only 12 pieces in our pie, so only 12 of us can eat from that. So it's kind of much more than that, of looking at how we all have that role to play. We're not giving it out just to select people. It's that whole, we all have this space. It's not just the leaders or the HR folks. It's truly all of us, working together, rowing together, and, helping when it goes to that. So through your work with, let's look at employee resource groups. How have you seen those? Because some organizations are really on board with, hey, let's look at doing some work. What are your thoughts on implementing ERGs within workplaces?
ERG networks can be a really valuable resource, right? Provided that there's very clear structure to them and that they are connected to the bigger DEI strategy and to the bigger organizational goals, right? So I think that they could be a real source of support for employees, just kind of trying to find other people that kind of get, I'm looking for some other trans people that are just going to get, like, our healthcare plan's kind of okay, but like, are you getting what you need? Because here's where I'm encountering some challenges. And when managed effectively, those kind of conversations can be filtered up to a DEI council. It depends on how an organization structures this, or to a DEI office, or at least to a chief DEI officer, right? And that person really can kind of keep their fingers on the pulse of trends happening throughout the organization that can be shared with the C-suite, can be shared with the executive leadership team of, in general, like, things are going well. However, there's a couple things that are showing up for these different groups of employees. And, here's the plan, here's the strategy. It's almost like you have these mini focus groups that can constantly inform, like, what is kind of culture feeling like right now? What's going well? What can we improve? And what's really great about that, right, is that if you have these spaces for employees to gather, connect, organize around, trying to build a healthier culture, you get out ahead of what happens on the HR side of things, which is, okay, this is like the 6th time that someone has intentionally misgendered me. I cannot believe that they're intentionally using pronouns that are not the pronouns that I, like, whatever that is. Once I go to HR, at least in the United States, I don't know how it works in Canada, but HR has the responsibility to initiate an investigation. Even if I didn't want an investigation to happen, right? That train can start to leave the station. And when that happens, other people can be brought in, and it might create an even more hostile environment for the employee that was brave enough just to kind of say, hey, like, this is not working for me. I need this to be addressed. So the ERGs can kind of get out ahead of kind of having a space where more anonymized information can be shared, because you're just sharing trends, depending on how these are set up. When there's an urgency just to create some ERGs because you see a competitor doing that without thinking through the strategy of what's it for, how will it be managed, how does it fit into our broader culture strategy, that's where things can go sideways, right? And so to me, it almost feels like, of course, ERGs, right? And yet I see some organizations that were very eager to get those set up after the police murder of George Floyd in 2020, and not managed responsibly, not really integrated into that broader strategy. And then a couple of years later disbanded because the groups themselves became a place just to complain rather than to kind of see a role of how to be a part of something to build something better. So that's where, of course, like, bringing folks like yourself or myself, like, bringing in outside experts to kind of guide an organization through those processes and asking the questions that might, in the sense of urgency, which is, a whole other conversation, some of those details will get missed, and you really you miss out on the opportunity of kind of the entry before, like, implementing something, like really going through that thought exercise of how this fits into the bigger picture.
Yeah. Yeah, I find that ERGs are really interesting because every organization, well, some organizations have them, other organizations have specific ones, which is amazing. Like, well, I guess the bigger the organization, you can have 5 or 6 different types. Some organizations are smaller, so they just might have one leading with just a DEI, their working group or network. But I think you're right that if they're not set up in the right ways, linking back to missions, values, that whole robust strategy, then they may be missing out on what the whole purpose is and the point is. So it's just there as a nice to have, or, oh yeah, of course we have an ERG, just like such and such, because, we're competitors and yeah, we're just as good. So it's for the right reasons that you're setting them up and you're wanting to actually give some budget and monies around and some capacity so people can actually be involved and help shift and change, because this is a culture thing that we're looking at within organizations.
Could I add one other thing to what you just shared too, is that, and I see this more with larger corporations that have had a decades plus long commitment to this work. So organizations that got started in 80s and 90s, right? These groups, right, like they have a lot of resource comparatively to maybe smaller organizations. However, they see these groups, they don't even call them ERGs, they call them BRGs. So they're business resource groups. They're part of a broader strategy. And at least for most of them at the co-chair level. So people that they have jobs doing other things, they've raised their hand to say, hey, I want to be a part of this group. Not only do I want to be a part of the group, I want to be an active leader, a co-chair. That those folks are getting compensated or they're getting bonuses for what they're adding, right? So some lived experience, like also the time and resource to manage the groups, to host events, to help educate other folks in the workforce. It's really smart, right? Because they are part of a strategy, and that strategy will help that business perform better because they're improving culture. And so that's also something that sometimes organizations that are moving really fast and they're going through the thought exercises, in my opinion, a little too quickly, balk at that idea of, oh my gosh, we would pay people to do something that's just social for them, and it's like they're missing the bigger picture in that. And so so I often point to kind of those larger organizations and the examples that they're setting, because they're very sophisticated. They see this as a strategy to build something better than what they've got right now. And so it's an interesting approach.
It is. And I guess there's been a lot of debate around, putting money into them, who's going to lead them up, the roles they're going to play. Is it during work time? Is it, what I mean? Is this a piece of your role? How should we select people to be, a part of these? Just all leading back into their bigger strategic plan. And where does this fall to underneath their pillars or underneath their mission and value statement, and what this looks like? Because if we're just going to throw an ERG in there, and there's no real thought around it and what they're going to do and whether there are terms of reference and all those things, it's I think one of those business strategies that's sometimes missing that can be so easily a part of your organization and just create a whole lot of good when it looks at, policies to, everything really.
Yeah. And like two values that I think transcend many, many differences, right? Like as just kind of human beings, two values are community and belonging, right? So it always astonishes me when people are like, well, why would we invest in this? Like, what's the return on investment? And, at the same time, they're doing out of HR engagement surveys. Oh, wow. Like our employees aren't very engaged. Well, you've got like these groups that immediately people can plug into. And if designed effectively, right, sure, you can have an LGBT ERG, or you can have an ERG for Black employees, or, an ERG for new managers, like whatever the ERG is, right? That, of course, it's the members who belong to the group, and making space for allies, right? Like certain times, like you invite in allies. Maybe there's other times when you want to have more of a closed door conversation, right? But that's a way of then building proximity to people who may have never, outside of the workplace, had the opportunity to have a real relationship with someone who has a different identity, on a number of different demographics, so it's that, and then you're immediately building community. You're building a place where people, can start to build more safety, more trust with each other, foundations for starting to feel a sense of belonging. And then you can reassess. Let's look at our engagement numbers again, and maybe ask a couple of questions. Do you belong to an ERG? And then you can start to disaggregate data, like, are members of ERG feeling more engagement than members who are not? So these are examples when people are like, well, how do we measure the effectiveness of DEI? It's not like, it is not difficult, right? It's just a matter of what is important to you when it comes to workplace culture. And then how do you assess different interventions that you introduce that are part of DEI strategies? Like, is that shifting the dynamic in a positive way? Is it moving the needle in the direction that we want? And then what comes from that? I mean, there's enough research out there, academic research, that shows when employees feel more connected, or they feel more safety or more trust, right? There's more innovation, there's more creativity, there's better products and services, there's more business success. So it still astounds me that people are still looking for that business case. And it's like, well, great. That's an easy thing to fulfill. Like, we can just do a quick, can do a quick lit review. You can get all of that. And when you're ready to make those investments, these are some of the benefits that you'll immediately start to realize. So I think, like, ultimately, it goes back to what you're talking about with the pie, right? Is that, and especially for leaders, like, my background is in economics. And so, like, in our world, there's a thing called loss aversion. And loss aversion occurs when people would rather avoid losing something like money, in the world of economics, than the promise of gaining something. So I could tell you, you might have $500,000 in the bank, right? And I could say, look, Stephanie, like, if you, take this risk, and it might involve investing some of that money, like, just by taking that risk, you're going to have $2 million by the end of the year. And you might say, no way, I am not risking this little percentage of that money. That's loss aversion. You're experiencing
I would
that.
say, Rhodes, 100%. Sign me up right now.
Yeah, all right. You like the risk, right? And unfortunately,
100%.
like, when it comes to this work, a lot of leaders feel that they will lose some sense of power, status, or they might fail, right? And so it clouds their better judgment of what they're going to gain from investing in this work. And at the end of the day, it's like, they're going to forever be remembered for making positive shifts in their organization, number one. Employees are going to stick around for the long haul, and especially for these younger generations where DEI is non-negotiable, and not just like a statement or some values. It's like, it's younger people, younger professionals want to see the outcomes, right? Going back to Lily's work, the outcomes of, how things change. Like, we recognize you're a work in progress. Where can I plug in? Like these younger professionals have more savvy questions for recruiters, and it behooves an organization to be preparing those recruiters to answer, or at least point those folks in the right direction. Because if they can't, they've missed the opportunity on some really good talent. So, lots of, it's just one of those things that it lives in our subconscious. So it's sometimes, oh, no, I'm good with that, right? And I think if for a lot of us to just kind of, really kind of assess, like, am I really feeling that? And, like, what are ways that I can be more aware, when it shows up? And can I talk to folks, can I talk to folks like you or me or other people around, what are some of my own strategies as a leader that I could manage this effectively, right? And how can I even be aware of it? Because I think for a lot of us, like, how would I even know if it's subconscious, right? So that's the benefit of bringing in experts who can help. So yeah.
What are your thoughts on different types of training? So, a lot of organizations go, oh, I need the unconscious bias training. And I always cringe with that one. And I say that because it's just like, I know we need trainings. We need a whole bunch of trainings in different areas. And when I first started looking at what training should I start developing, and I started developing that one, and I started thinking about it and giving it, and I was like, it's kind of like a negative way. So it's not a big draw, but everyone's like unconscious bias, almost on that train of we need to be doing that. But it's so awkward and uncomfortable when you get people in sessions, because no one wants to say, I'm sexist, I'm racist, I'm homophobic, I'm whatever that is, right? So thoughts on trainings that organizations should be looking at? What does that look like for you in your world?
Yeah, I mean, I think learning and development training, like that's essential. The content, right? Like what people will be learning is something that I think it's important. I mean, there's entire fields of study about, like, what's effective. And I think number one is, from my perspective, right? Like, if you're going to do a training of all employees, right? Well, then when we go back to the DEI acronym, like what are we trying to do within that? Not everybody in a kind of an all staff training, for example, has the positional power to address issues of equity, right? So maybe that's where SHRM is like, well, let's just drop the letter. I don't agree with that. I think there's trainings for leaders, right, that have the ability to start to look at systems and structures, right? But again, not everybody has that. So what is it for? I would argue if there's kind of an all staff kind of training, it's really thinking about inclusion, right? Because we're talking about interpersonal behaviors that we can have an outcome. We would like to see a shift, and we would, a value in our organization is curiosity. Well, what are some skills? Could I teach 3 skills in 90 minutes that would give everyone in the organization the ability to succeed in demonstrating curiosity, right? So, so I think if we think about training in general as skill building, as kind of, a learning lab, or, sorry, it's like a military term, but like a boot camp of some sort.
Yeah.
That's designed to make people feel successful at the end of that session, right? By the end of this session, you're going to learn 3 basic skills. This isn't going to be like everything under the sun, but it's enough to address some of these common challenges that, some of our colleagues are experiencing. We don't want that, right? Like we can agree, we want innovation and, or, whatever the values are.
Yeah.
Like if you can connect the learning opportunity to the value and what you're trying to build, and what everyone's role is in that, and that they're going to be successful in it, then it's going to be, people will see, this is going to help me in my job. Thank you. Instead of like, well, this is great to learn about, settler colonialism, and I got a good history lesson, and now I have a lot of questions, but how does this relate to my work, right? And I do think that there's places for those kind of conversations. And I think that's the value of the ERG. We're going to have a lunch and learn, we're going to learn about something that impacts, the modern day workplace, right? That's really important, right? But if you're asking people, and for people to opt into that, wow, that's going to be really interesting. I'd love to go and support this ERG, versus trainings that, and we can go into like the mandatory versus opting in. If you're offering kind of a learning and development where people are building skills that are of value to them, that will allow them to ascend within that organization, because they now have some of the skills that they didn't have that are being evaluated, right? Like, and again, it just kind of goes back to, how does this fit in? So back to your opening question, people are contacting you, hey, can we have an unconscious bias training? It's like, whoa. Like, walk me through your math here. Like, what's your learning and development strategy more broadly this year? How does this fit into the next 3 years? Why did you contact me? Like, what about my work? Do you see as helping you get to that? And those can be really dynamic conversations that I think for any of us who are consultants or external folks, like that could be a whole workshop we can give to each other, around like how to really determine readiness, and like, am I the right one to do what you want, or are you just checking a box? And if it's just checking a box, no, thank you. I'm not here for the performative. Like, I really want to, like if you are going to invest money kind of working with me, then like, let's do something great to get you to where you want to be. Right. So, I think, that's the value of having these conversations with folks like us, is just to get to get some of these employers to show their math, like where are they at in the process? Where do they want to be? And how does this kind of learning and development engagement get them there? And sometimes they don't, sometimes it ends up being a completely different engagement, because then they're like, oh, we're not quite there yet. We still need to do this piece of the puzzle, right? We still need to find our champions. We still need to build the structure to kind of manage this work. We still need to hire someone to like really make sure that this work carries through. So anyway, like I just think like that's really it's learning and development is so important, because also like when we think about these skills, not many of us have learned these, in primary school, secondary education, even in college or vocational schools, right? Like these are skills that, I mean, they're about relationship building, and they are valuable life skills that certainly in the workplace matter, right? But they're going to improve every kind of relationship that you have with another human being, even with yourself, by doing some of that personal work. And I think that was the other piece in your question is like
Yeah.
not putting people on the spot when they're
Yeah.
learning. And so that's really from the design of a professional coming in to deliver those engagements. That's where it really matters to have someone that has some experience to not cause more harm, right? Because the last thing that you want to do as you're trying to build a better culture is to bring someone in that you're not quite, I mean, like you haven't discussed like some of the learning kind of engagements that are going to happen. Are we going to do individual work? And then what do we do with that work? Will we have small groups, and how are we supporting those small groups in case things go sideways? And large group discussions, what are some of those learning agreements to create a container where we can't guarantee safety, but we can sure do our best to try to nurture it throughout. And so I think that's also really, really key. And sometimes for employers, they're not that discerning, right? It's just like, oh, great, like we have someone that's going to do this thing. And again, like if they're just checking the box,
Yeah.
if they haven't asked, a facilitator, what is your philosophy in doing this work? How will you set this up? What are the conditions for safety and trust that you're trying to build here? Harm can very well happen. And then, for those of us that see that, then it makes our job a little more challenging because there's place where we have to create some space to kind of work through that harm, to repair it, there's no guarantees for that. And then to try to create something different when people then already have kind of maybe a negative experience of this. So really, really important. And there's a lot of factors to consider for those learning and development professionals internally when they're trying to bring people in to do different DEI engagements.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess a good takeaway is looking at the psychological safety in your organization, looking at some of your, I guess, strategies that you have to set up, because when we give sessions, we don't know sometimes who's on the other end of the session, who's listening in, who the participants are, really their values, some of the encounters they may have had in the workspace, and now we're expecting them to, let's have a great conversation around diversity and inclusion, right? Like we're asking a lot sometimes, right? And organizations don't quite understand that space of, they may not know where gender identities, they may not know where sexual orientations, they may not know all those intersectionalities about us. So definitely setting the right stage and creating that space. I see that as being, top on that ladder of, within the organization of things to do. What are your thoughts on the psychological safety piece?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. And I think like the first thing that came to mind as you were speaking is the trauma-informed approach, right? Is, as you design these experiences, like how are we creating the conditions where people can take interpersonal risks without fear of negative consequences? That's the psychological safety component. And it takes a skilled facilitator to know what trauma is, to understand that, to some degree, like you may know the audience in terms of, well, this is the function of the employee that's showing up. Here's some of the conversations that have happened, some things that have been challenging for us. Here's what you might expect from some of the participants, right? And still, like, you don't have those kind of deep relationships with each person in the room. So being mindful of, potential conversations that could be triggering, and how do you enter those very important conversations, right? In a way that's inviting in voice, right? Without, again, causing harm. And I think that's very, very critical. And there's, we could talk a lot. I mean, this could be like entirely other podcast episodes on how to do that. But these are important things for your listeners just to kind of think through. And hopefully that's helpful. But the psychological safety piece is essential for learning and engagements. But beyond that, like it's an essential component that just needs to be in the workplace to then be able to build trust with others, which is the currency of doing business, right? Like if you don't trust other people that you work with, not much is going to happen, right? Not much of that magic is going to happen. And when those two elements are in place, right? Because we're constantly, like before we started our interview, we were probably doing this, subconsciously. Am I safe? And do I trust you? And that's kind of going back and forth, right? we're constantly asking that question every time we show up in different workplace settings, because the constellation of people and the environments are always shifting. And when we can say yes to both of those questions, we're more likely to feel the elements of belonging. And if we're not, right, something's up for like where we're at. We're like, okay, I'm not feeling a sense of belonging. I don't feel safe. I don't trust those around me. That's really good information too, right? Like you might not be able to act on anything. You might not be able to leave the situation because it's like, oh, this is a mandatory meeting. I have to be here. But over time, if you're feeling that more than kind of the safety and trust, it's an indication that, maybe this isn't the right place for me long term. And that's hard to, it's a hard conclusion to arrive at. And, it can be helpful for us just to kind of identify like, what are the values that I have that are really important when I show up at work? And, can I take a scan of maybe other organizations or opportunities that like have those pieces that aren't happening for me right now? So again, it's not something necessarily we can change overnight. And it's something that we ought not to ignore, because over time that can take serious impacts. It can take a serious toll on our health.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that conversation. We'll end this segment here. If people want to, anything else you want to add before we end, and how can people reach out to you if they want to connect?
Yeah, thank you. Nothing to add. I mean, this has been really great. And I just looked up at the time and like, oh gosh, okay, we're just getting started and we're already done. So really easy. If people want to connect with me, rhodesperry.com. That's my website. There's a contact page, lots of ways to engage with my work. And you can find the book Belonging at Work, also Imagine Belonging. Those are my two books. And I welcome people, check out the work, if it resonates, if it causes, a thought, I always welcome conversation. So please don't be a stranger.
Amazing. Thanks so much for joining in today. I appreciate it greatly.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.